In today's episode of Dracula, a Reader's Guide, we're going to be talking about the big vampire himself, Dracula. Quite possibly the most famous vampire of all time. He's been adapted in thousands of different ways, as a terrifying monster, as a seductive nobleman. This is the big archetype for vampire literature. And in this episode, we'll be trying to understand the character of Dracula and also be looking a little bit at the mythology of vampires as it appears in Stoker, but also beyond as well. First, I'll argue that there are three main forces in Dracula represented by some of the characters, including the vampires. We have pagan forces representing nature and brutality, represented in Dracula and the vampires. We have Christian forces represented by some of the more religious characters in the story and the people in Transylvania. And we have rationalists exemplified by characters like Jonathan and Dr. Seward. I'll argue that while all of the heroes tend to fit into either the Christian or rationalist camps, all of them have to dip into paganism in order to defeat Dracula. Next, we'll look at Dracula as a nobleman, and we'll see how nobility is portrayed in the story, both in Transylvania and in England. And then we'll look at androgyny. Vampires throughout literature, from Dracula to early novels like Carmilla, all the way up to Anne Rice, are often somewhat androgynous either in appearance or in the ways that they behave. So we'll be exploring this in relation to Dracula. Part 1. Vampires, a pagan force of nature. Now, paganism is a tricky thing to define, partly because, historically at least, it was used by Christians to describe non-Christians and their various cultural and folk practices. And so there's not really a unified religious tradition of paganism in the way that there is with Christianity. Really, in this historical sense, paganism just means the antithesis of Christianity. And that's certainly how paganism, I think, is portrayed in Dracula as well. The pagan forces of the vampires are the antithesis of the Christian forces. But paganism also has a broader meaning than this. Paganism is a philosophy in which we revere the natural world, and not just in the sentimental, oh my god, isn't it beautiful way, but also in the terrible way. We appreciate and bend to the terrible aspects of nature as much as we appreciate the beautiful ones. To be a pagan in this sense is not to deny yourself bodily pleasures either. Pagans are very much of the body, and they see themselves as sensual beings, and they revere nature and the physical world as opposed to the purely spiritual or abstract. Christianity, on the other hand, serves primarily a spiritual realm, by which I mean the focus is on God up in heaven, and heaven itself as the end goal of all our actions in life. So in that sense, there's an anti-nature component to Christianity. It doesn't matter if you have to deny yourself bodily pleasure as a Christian, because you will be rewarded later in the afterlife. But we also have a third tradition at play in the novel as well, and this is rationalism. Here we find that the head and the intellect are privileged over things like sensuality, nature, or even spirituality. And obviously this is exemplified most in Jonathan Harker and Dr. Seward, and to some extent Van Helsing, although we will talk a bit more about this with him in a future episode. Right at the beginning of the novel, we see rationality collapse in the face of the horrors of the vampires as Jonathan succumbs to Dracula and his brides, and he turns to spirituality. But the spirituality of Jonathan is definitely of the Christian rather than pagan kind. It seems to me that, although it's not explicitly stated in the story, vampires are very much pagan creatures. Firstly, they belong to a tradition of folklore that is not Christian, even if they are described in Christian terms in the story by Van Helsing and the rest of the characters. Vampires are very sensual creatures, and they privilege the desire for blood above all else. There is also a sexual aspect to vampires. We see this most in Lucy, where all of her sexual desires come out once she's in vampiric form. And it's these pagan forces that the vampires revel in that the Christian characters, or just the human characters, repress and try and hide from. One of the first things that Dracula says about Jonathan is that he cannot enter into the feelings of the hunter. This notion of vampires as hunters comes up a lot in the story, both when Jonathan is seduced by Dracula's brides and when Lucy is out hunting children to consume. Vampires are all hunters. They are wild, feral creatures that are also very beautiful, but also very terrible. They revel in both sides of this duality. They're not hiding their pagan sides. They're bringing out everything, and they're embracing everything about them, the beautiful and the terrible. We see this most clearly in Dracula's brides at first, because they exemplify both at once. They're very beautiful and seductive, but they're also terrifying. Dracula, it takes a bit more time, because when we meet him for the first time, he's old and decrepit, but he still has his charm, and it takes a while for Jonathan to see the ugliness that lurks underneath that. The entire essence of a vampire seems to be to consume life. In order to live, they must consume the life and blood of human beings, and they seem to privilege this above all else. We see this in the fact that the castle is entirely decrepit. It doesn't seem like the Count has many interests outside of going to England and doing everything he can to get there, but he is ultimately going there to feed as well. As immortal creatures, vampires don't need to be consoled by the idea of God and heaven. Nor do they care that much, it seems, for rationality and reason, insofar as it helps them get their plans. It's great, but otherwise they're happy just to exist and to feed. That vampires represent pagan forces is also seen in the way that they react to Christian iconography. And this makes sense given that they are the antithesis to Christianity, and that's what it means to be a pagan in this sense. But what's interesting about vampires is, at least in Stoker's novel, they're not killed directly by anything remotely Christian. And in fact, the way to kill a vampire is incredibly brutal and resembles more a pagan sacrifice. In order to put an end to Lucy, our heroes have to chop off her head, stake her through the heart, and stuff her mouth full of garlic. What is interesting here is it seems like Stoker's novel is compatible both with a Christian and perhaps a pagan mythology. And it seems like in order for the characters to truly defeat the vampires, they have to become pagans, at least a little bit, themselves. They have to bring out their brutal sides and use that to destroy the vampires. Part 2. Dracula, the noble bloodsucker. Dracula is a member of an ancient and noble family in the Carpathians. Nobility and vampirism often go hand in hand in Gothic literature, and nobility in general seems to be a common theme in classic literature as well. We first meet the Count at his castle in the mountains, which is an ancient castle and very decrepit, much like the Count himself. Although the Count's home clearly shows a waning nobility, the peasants all still fear their overlord, now because they are afraid that he'll feed from their loved ones rather than because of his political power. There is an interesting similarity between vampires and nobility. Just like vampires, who need the blood of human beings to subsist, the nobility also rely on the blood and sweat of the workers in order to subsist on their land and to keep up their lavish lifestyles. In one of the most terrifying parts of the book, we see how Dracula is still very much a leech on the peasants, as he murders a woman with a pack of wolves and then takes her baby and feeds this to his brides. As a vampire, Dracula and his brides don't need the money and taxation from the peasants, but they do need the blood of the poor to keep themselves going. Now, although the Count starts off an old man, when he moves across the sea to England, the next time we encounter him, he presents himself as much younger and handsome in appearance. The old noble has been revivified by the blood of Lucy, and of course the men aboard the Demeter. It seems that in feeding, Stoker's vampires de-age and become more beautiful. If this is true, then it seems like back in the Carpathians, the Count must have been struggling for food, perhaps just privileging his brides since they have retained their beauty, but not for himself. And perhaps this is because in the Carpathians, the peasants, as much as they fear the Count, they are aware of what he is, and they do believe in that spiritual stuff, and so they're able to resist him to some extent. Whereas in wonderful rationalist England, where no one believes in any of that stuff anymore, it's much easier for the Count to prey on those people. And so we find Dracula at the beginning, this eccentric noble Count, going from that to England, where he transforms into a handsome modern gentleman in Victorian London. Classic Gothic novels often focus on the nobility, and they're often set in these labyrinthine, scary castles in exotic locations. And Stoker's novel begins with all of these tropes firmly in place. The Count is a noble, his castle is in the heart of the Carpathian Mountains, and it's a huge, terrifying place. But unlike those classic Gothic novels like Radcliffe's, Stoker moves the action away from these places and brings it right into the heart of English civilization, right into the bedrooms of his readers. Part 3. Dracula and Racial Fears. I remember once watching this horror TV show, I can't remember the name of it now, but it gathered around some horror writers around a table and a very, very lavish set design. It was like a Gothic feast, and these writers talked about Gothic literature. And one of my favourite writers, Clive Barker, was in this video, and he made a distinction between two different kinds of horror. There was conservative horror, and I think he called it liberal horror, but I'm not sure. But the distinction basically is this. In conservative horror, the evil in the story is exterior to the characters. It's a force out there that must be defeated, and the heroines or heroes are wonderful and virtuous, and they're not marred by the darkness out there. And then we have this notion of liberal horror, where the horror is not so much in things out there, it's in things inside us. It's our weaknesses, it's our dark side, and it's those things that drive the horror of the story. Now, Barker definitely fits this liberal tradition. In most of his stories, although there are monsters, oftentimes it's the human beings who are the monsters, not the ugly, scary things. Now on the surface, and I think Barker probably would suggest this, it seems like Stoker's novel fits into the conservative mould, and perhaps even the extreme end of this conservative mould as well. On one popular interpretation that comes up quite a lot, the Count, as the strange foreign invader of England, represents the fear of migration in Victorian England at the time, brought about by advances in technology that allows people to move across the world much easier than before. Not only that, but the Count's violation of two of the female characters is also taken to represent white men's anxiety about foreign invaders coming and taking their women from them. Now, when we first meet Dracula, we do learn that he has taken a huge interest in England and the English language and culture. He wants to go to England and he wants to be able to perfectly blend in with anyone else, and he seems to relish in his ability to do so. And perhaps this is meant to scare the reader a little bit, the idea that this foreigner can come and assimilate, but secretly he is a bloodthirsty killer. The significance of race also plays a role in Stoker's mythology. It's part of Stoker's vampire lore that vampires not only have to sleep under the earth at night, but they have to sleep in the earth of the country where they are from. And it's exactly this that allows our heroes to defeat Dracula. They destroy all of his crates that have his home soil in them, so he's forced to retreat back to Transylvania, where they can eventually defeat him. Now the metaphor here then seems to be that one can't truly shake off their racial identity, or at least their cultural one. No matter how much Dracula tries to fit in, he needs to sleep in his soil. He needs to go back. Now, despite agreeing with some aspects of this interpretation, in particular the point about soil I do find quite interesting, I do think it is a little bit overstated. Firstly, I think that there is a contextual reason for Stoker to have chosen the particular location that he was interested in, which goes beyond any fear of migration point. As I said in the first episode of this series, Stoker was inspired by the Carpathian Mountains and the stories of vampires and mythology from a Jewish Hungarian writer and traveller. So I think it's a bit harsh to condemn Stoker with racial interpretations when part of his motivation for setting his story there seems to be genuinely being inspired by the tales of someone from this place. Secondly, I also think Stoker is doing something a little bit more subtle than just kind of portraying the East as this irrational, mysterious place and the West as this rational, wonderful place. At the start of the novel, we find characters like Jonathan and Mina and Dr. Seward all taking pride in their English rationality and superiority. We see this most clearly in Jonathan as he's travelling through the mountains and comparing the two cultures and realising how superstitious the Transylvanians are in comparison to the British. But before Jonathan even meets Dracula, he's slowly becoming less and less convinced by rationality. He's slowly slipping back into that superstition, and he buys into it completely. So it's my view that all of the English characters in the novel are under a kind of delusion. And their delusion is that they are these perfectly rational characters, divorced from their pagan and even Christian heritages, in opposition to Dracula, who is this foreign, pagan invading force. But in actuality, what we find in the characters, when they come into contact with the vampires, is that they do have these deep-seated desires within them too. It's not that it's a purely external force and these characters are wonderful and pure, because these forces live in these characters as well. We see this most clearly in Lucy when she becomes a vampire and all of those forces come out, but it's also in Jonathan when he's seduced by the vampires and he kind of enjoys it as much as he's afraid. We see it in Mina when she goes for Dracula as well, at least in the moment when she's still hypnotized and sucking his blood. All of these Western characters are full of pent-up emotions, they're volatile creatures, and all of those pagan forces are within them as much as they are within the vampires. The only difference is that the vampires relish in this aspect of their character, whereas the Victorian Englanders do not and try and hide it. So the horror of Dracula is not the horror of the invader coming to our shores. The horror instead, to me, seems to be the pagan forces that Dracula represents, and those forces coming into contact with Western Christian ideology and rational ideology as well. And when this contact occurs, those pagan forces boil up inside the human beings as well, and they have to confront them as much as they have to confront the vampires. In this way, then, I think Stoker is ultimately blurring the line between this conservative and liberal style of horror mentioned by Barker. Yes, there's this external force, but it's awaking the horror lurking in the minds of the heroes. Part 4. Mina and Dracula, Vampires and Androgyny. We've already looked a little bit at certain gender reversals in the story, most notably when Jonathan is hunted by the brides and he takes a passive, submissive feminine role as the brides take on a dominant hunter role as they're seducing and devouring him. And we also have, of course, the major rejection of motherhood with all of the female vampires devouring or hunting children. Now, this subversion, not only of gender expectations, but of biological sex in some cases, seems to be part and parcel with becoming a vampire, and this applies equally to the male vampires as to the women. This is most apparent in one of the big reveals of the story, when Mina is discovered feeding herself from Dracula's breast. With his left hand, he held both of Mrs. Harker's hands, keeping them away with her arms in full tension. His right hand gripped her by the back of the neck, forcing her face down on his bosom. Here we find Dracula playing the maternal role. Dracula is the great mother giving suck to the babe in his arms. Naturally, when the heroes discover this, they are horrified at this inversion of traditional human roles. But in the vampiric world, there is no real gender and really no real sex aside from just the superficial attributes. There's no real male and female in any substantive way, because vampires do not procreate in the way that human beings do. All of the things, biologically or socially, that matter to human beings are just irrelevant when it comes to vampires. Now, of course, in the context of Dracula, this is not presented in a positive light at all. It's meant to be horrifying to the reader to see women eating children and Mina feeding up from Dracula's breast. But what's interesting is that these themes of androgyny play out even in modern vampire stories as well. Think of Anne Rice's vampires. They're all androgynous to varying degrees. Their sexual preferences are open to pretty much anyone, and their actions can go from being hyper-feminine to hyper-masculine depending on the situation. Even the beauty of a vampire like Edward Cullen from the Twilight series has an androgynous quality to him. He's sparkly and bright and pretty rather than this big, bulky hunk. Since vampires operate outside of biological sex and gender, they're able to liberate themselves from those things. For Stoker, this is something that is dangerous and terrifying, but for Rice and other more modern novelists, this is liberating. The big difference, of course, though, between the modern and the classic vampire, though, is that the modern ones are a bit more toothless when compared to the classics. Alright, that's it for this video. Let me know down in the comments what you think of this video. Always look forward to reading your thoughts and responding to them as well, so please leave a comment. Take care everyone, I'll see you all in the next video. Ta-ra!